Imagine this. An armored truck, steel plates and lock safes, carrying $12.5 million in bills, rolling down a busy downtown street in broad daylight. And then, 7 minutes later, it simply doesn't exist. No gunfire, no dramatic chase, no huddle of masked men hauling sacks into a getaway car. Just a gap in the city's surveillance, a silence on the radio, and a ledger of losses on a manager's desk. Before we begin, tell me, what's the first explanation that comes to your mind? Drop in the comments now. I'll be reading. The city that morning hummed with the small, indifferent noises of ordinary life. Coffee steam, subway brakes, the distant rumble of interstate traffic. It was late September, the kind of Thursday that feels like summer trying to hold on. Warm light, crisp shadows. The armored truck belonged to Fortress Security Logistics, a private firm that prided itself on predictable routes and ironclad routines. Their vehicles were as much a part of the city's fabric as the streetlights. People noticed them only when their ATM made a card or the bank posted a temporarily closed sign. Routine disguised safety. Routine was supposed to be predictable. Routine that day became a riddle. On paper, the route was unremarkable. Pick up at Midwest National Bank at 10:12 a.m., then a scheduled loop through municipal centers and a transit hub before returning to the depot. The truck itself was a matte gray behemoth. Plated doors, reinforced cab, cameras bolted in like watchful eyes. Inside, the cargo manifest listed 125 sealed bags, bundles of bills stamped with Fortress tracking codes, totaling $12.5 million. 2 guards were assigned. Daniel Mercer, a 42-year-old with a decade of service and the sort of face that looked like it had been shaped by coffee and duty, and Tyrell Hayes, 29, 3 months on the job, nervous laugh, new shoes. They loaded the cash in the bank's back lot under neutral autumn light. Someone joked about the coffee being extra strong. No one noticed anything else. Daniel signed a clipboard with a practiced hand. Tyrell double-checked the seals. The truck's diesel engine hummed. Steel doors closed, and at 10:19 it rolled away from a curb. That is where the trail should have begun, steady and trackable. The transmission of GPS pings, the routine check-ins, the predictable arrival at the next stop. For 7 minutes, the camera at the bank watched the armored truck tuck into the lane, signal, and turn down Jefferson Avenue. And then the footage stopped showing the truck. A gap. The next camera at the corner bakery, at the laundromat, at the municipal building recorded nothing, as if someone had shuttered the city's eyes for the length of a single breath. By the time supervisors realized something was wrong, the truck had already failed to report at its second stop. Dispatch protocols triggered like dominoes. Fortress Security's control room called wave after wave of queries. Their live tracking software registered a normal departure and then flatlined. The route that should have been a sequence became a question mark. Police units converged on every intersection. Officers interrogated traffic cameras, scrutinized footage frame by slow frame, and sent patrol cars to follow up on the truck's last registered bearing. A skyline of street cameras, storefronts, parking garages, office towers was combed for any sign of the armored truck's bulky silhouette. Dogs sniffed curbs. Drone units swept in the sky, their rotors a weak answer to the sudden vacuum of facts. Yet the city returned only silence and static where it should have returned steel and cash. Impossible, one detective said later, not as a dismissal but as astonishment. How does 20,000 pounds of armored steel, painted a shade the color of authority, vanish from a city where every corner is a witness? The first and easiest theory, hijacking, crumbled under the details. There were no reports of gunshots, no witnesses describing a robbery in progress, no emergency calls from the guards themselves. The officers' attention turned inward. It might be cleaner to suspect that the rules had been broken from within. Inside job, the word rustled through the newsroom and the elevators. Inside job suggested motives you could tally, debts, greed, blackmail, but it also suggested access, knowledge, and execution. Someone knew the rhythm of the truck. Someone planned the silence. This suspicion cast long searches both at work and at home. Daniel's apartment was immaculate in a way that said habit. His boots were arranged, his coffee mug in the sink. The TV left playing a late-night rerun pause mid-sentence. Tyrell's studio, by contrast, had unpaid notices tacked to the door, a stack of fast food wrappers, and a credit card bill creased in a way that whispered about owed money. Investigators interviewed colleagues, friends, and ex-lovers. Daniel was described as meticulous, quietly proud of his record. Tyrell is eager, sometimes rash, talking about getting ahead, with a tone that suggested he hadn't yet learned how the world loses people to promises. Neighbors, co-workers, a supervisor's casual observation. Each detail fed the suspicion that the men may have colluded. But when detectives went to the two guards' last known addresses, they found empty rooms and unanswered phones. Both men had disappeared with the truck. If the two guards had orchestrated it, the plan had been uncommonly clean. No calls, no digital breadcrumbs, no plane tickets right away. If they had been victims, the absence of bodies at the burn sites that later emerged only deepened the unease. The first break in the case came 3 days after the vanishing, when a farmer 40 miles outside the city stumbled across a collapsed barn and something scorched tucked against its broken rafters. A charred shell of metal lay half swallowed by hay and dirt. Investigators who arrived with hazmat suits and the methodical air of people handling evidence hoped for closure, at least to the question of the vehicle's fate. The vehicle, once examined, proved to be Fortress Security's missing truck. VIN matched, its plate numbers turned inwards, the interior gutted by fire. The money was gone. The two guards were not inside, and the fire had been set carefully enough to destroy most traceable evidence. At the burnout scene, a single latex glove, partially melted, lay apart from the ruin like a pale thumbprint. Forensics lifted it with gloved fingers. Inside, they found genetic material, enough to run through databases. The match did not return Daniel Mercer or Tyrell Hayes. It did return something else, a partial pattern that suggested multiple contributors, as if several people had handled that glove during the operation. This nugget changed the direction of the investigation. Rather than a neat two-man job, the crime hinted at a team, specialists who could move steel, incinerate clues, and vanish. The DNA led to dead ends in national databases, to unknown names and aliases. Whoever these players were, they knew how to keep their faces off state rosters. Meanwhile, detectives pursued a second lead, a grainy clip from a gas station camera 2 blocks from Jefferson Avenue. The clip showed a rental moving van, white and nondescript, pulling into a curb at 10:24 a.m., minutes after the armored truck's last confirmed sighting. The van's driver walked with slow, careful cadence, and in his posture detectives read the practiced reserve of someone used to hauling unusual loads. The van lingered for 20 minutes, then pulled away. The rental had been paid in cash. The driver listed a name that, when investigators traced it, turned out to be a fabricated identity. The credit card information attached to the booking was a series of burner cards. The pattern was clear. If it was staged, the staging had been done with tools meant to leave no purchase trail. Whoever had arranged the van had planned for the phone calls that would come searching for receipts and records. As the weeks folded into months, the public conversation around the disappearance took on a life of its own. Late-night hosts made jokes about phantom trucks. Conspiracy groups parsed the footage. Social feeds offered elaborate machinations ranging from corrupt officials to international cartels. Family members of Daniel and Tyrell sat in interview rooms that smelled of coffee and fluorescent bulbs, pleading ignorance and offering alibis they hoped would stick. The families received postcards at irregular intervals. No return address, a sentence or two in erratic handwriting. "We are safe." The card were evidence of life and provocation both. Handwriting analysts could not definitively link the scrawl to either guard, nor to any known suspect. If it was a missing men writing, it could be freedom. If it was their captors writing, it could be cruelty. If it was a mischievous third party, it was something worse, a game with human consequences. Then, like a bolt pulled from a clear sky, the case split open with an unexpected echo. 6 months after the armored truck vanished, a teller in a small bank branch 2 states away flagged a deposit. $200 in crisp, sequential $100 bills. The teller's training had the dollar amounts on a chip at the back of her mind. She noticed a coded stamp on the margins. Fortress Security tracking inks faintly visible under magnification. The serials matched the cargo manifest. The tendril of money had crossed state lines. The man making the deposit gave a name, Victor Sloan. He was not a name the investigators knew from the original inquiry. They found him in municipal records, a truck mechanic from Riverton, 37, with a history of small-time jobs and a sudden, unexplained uptick in paid bills shortly before the armored truck's disappearance. When officers approached Victor, his apartment told a story of hurried departure. Stove cold but dishes washed, a toothbrush in a cup, a wallet on the table. Interviews with neighbors suggested he had been visited the night before by a friend. The friend's name was not offered. Victor's phone pinged off a cell tower and then went silent. When detectives reached Victor's place, the impression was of someone who had stood at the edge of a life and then been pushed. His tools lay in the garage like unused promises. His ledger showed small cash infusions that could be explained with odd jobs until compared with the serial dates of the Fortress bills. Investigators found several stacks of bills stored in the false bottom of an oil drum in his yard, but every time they reached into that seam, they turned up less than they expected. Victor's testimony, while he was briefly available, was a mixture of fear, deflection, and assertion. I got into this deeper than I thought. I thought I could walk away. When pressed to name names, he said only. They said I'd be safe. They said keep quiet. Days later, Victor disappeared from his motel room with the same abruptness as the armored truck. His footprints seemed to end at the motel's threshold. Guests remember a man leaving with a duffel bag while the night clerk looked away. Whether Victor left voluntarily or was taken, whether he was greedy or coerced, remained a riddle. Fire and flame and cold drawers of money became the case's truest motifs. Vehicles burned to ash, men evaporated from addresses, and bundles of bills moving like ghosts between hands. Forensic accountants traced the flow of cash into micro-deposits through small businesses, casino chips, and offshore accounts with names that were paper-thin. Every route led to another door that was bolted from the inside. The DNA from the latex glove produced partial matches to people with records. Petty thieves, an ex-con with a known nickname, a woman who had worked in logistics, but none of them tied directly to the operation in a way that could be prosecuted. The web was wide and fine, and impossible to haul into court. Public appetite for answers hardened into a demand. Newspapers ran timelines side by side, with grainy photos of the truck's last frame. Podcasts devoted entire episodes to theorizing how a secure haul could be rendered insecure. Fortress Security faced regulatory investigations and shareholder rage. The company's CEO sat for hours before a city council committee, explaining redundancies, and then describing the courage of staff who had worked 19-hour stretches to help with the investigation. The board instituted new protocols, GPS redundancies, tamper-proof seals that transmitted microscopic changes in pressure. But none of those reforms answered the central human puzzle. Where were Daniel and Tyrell? Were they the architects of their own disappearance, rebels against a paycheck, or the victims of a scheme that wanted two human faces to fade away so the plan could breathe? Inside the detective squad, theories accumulated like leaves. One line of thinking, advocated quietly by a grizzled detective who had seen too many vanishing acts, proposed a soft extraction. The guards were removed from the scene by threat or promise, placed in transit without fanfare, and then evacuated across borders with altered identities. This would require coordination, fake passports, a corridor of quiet hands, suggesting a criminal enterprise would reach. Another hypothesis held that the guards panicked when they recognized the setup and tried to run, winding up in the wrong place at the wrong time. A third, darker scenario proposed that an influential client of the bank wanted the money to disappear and could hire men to break a vehicle and erase people without leaving a trace. Each theory was plausible because each required a competence that seemed to exist on some seam of legality and social invisibility. There were signs of a master plan in the smallest choices. The rental van, for example, had been rented not from the company's main desk, but from a back office with low visibility. The timing of the burn was arranged for a stretch of time when the barn's owner was on a scheduled market trip. The GPS of the truck had been looped with a device that fed a fabricated trail for a precise interval, enough to throw off automated tracking, but not enough to suggest tampering on first glance. It read like the work of someone who had studied the system. The control software, the camera blind spots, the human routines that become laughably predictable if you watch them enough. The crime exploited the complacency of repetition, The assumption that routine cannot be betrayed because routine, by definition, repeats. But not every act of planning points to a single brain. As the detectives rediscovered again and again, complex crimes are made up of small competences. A locksmith who can defeat a seal, a driver who can time a route, someone who can light a fire without leaving a usable fingerprint. The presence of multiple DNA traces hinted that several hands had been involved in the work at the barn. Witnesses reported seeing a crew of men with heavy gloves moving items before the fire, though recollection was fuzzy and potentially contaminated by rumor. The crew's faces never appeared on a camera in full clarity. When one trace did appear, a sliver of a license plate in a drizzle of traffic cam. Investigators found the plate belonged to a vehicle that had been reported stolen months earlier and had since been used in other odd crimes with similarly clean endings. Patterns began to resemble the signature of a mobile unit. A team that worked quickly left small smears of evidence and then moved on to the next city. Months passed. The case became a collage. Small clues, large silences. People began to build narratives that fit their instincts. They would rather have a story than the sharp absence of explanation. Some believed the guard had walked away and were living new lives on beaches with stolen millions. Others believed they were dead, quietly erased to keep the operation airtight. A dedicated few believed the armored truck's disappearance was a message, an advert to anyone tempted by unsanctioned access to illicit cash. Crime, like opera, loves a moral. The silence, though, resisted tidy morals. The bank's vaults remained safe. The city's ATMs hummed. But for the families of the missing and for the investigators who had placed their names on report covers, the world had a hole in it the size of a truck. Years later, cold case detectives would still reopen the file, drawn by the sting of unfinished sentences. New techniques breathed peripheral life back into old evidence. DNA phenotyping could suggest racial background from scraps. Enhanced imaging teased clearer frames from archival footage. Yet the results were increments, not revelations. A bus route, a cabin on a lakeside property, a man who moved with too much care, all suggested possibilities but not a courtroom. The case lived in the margins of the city's memory, an urban legend for commuters. The armored truck that evaporated on a Thursday morning. Tourists would stop and point where the truck had last been seen, the plaque of the bank's sign reflecting sun. The people most affected by the void were not armchair sleuths or city officials, but the families of Daniel Mercer and Tyrell Hayes. Both families kept their loved ones' rooms like altars. Photographs of Daniel's quiet smile moved between hands during holidays. Tyrell's mother kept his new shoes in a closet, as if he might return to wear them. They filed papers, pursued leads when detectives had to move on to new cases, and lived their days suspended between hope and resignation. They received the same postcards others had. We are safe. Sometimes the cards came months apart, like a clock slowed to an impossible tick. Sometimes nothing came at all. The postcards never satisfied law enforcement because handwriting, context, and tone were not evidence of crime. They were at best an emotional lie or cruel truth. In the end, no definitive resolution presented itself. The burned truck was an empty altar. The scattered bills a trail that dissolved into small accounts. The missing men remained missing. The law closed the file with the label active cold case, a bureaucratic phrase that meant the city would not forget, but that justice, in its most concrete form, would not arrive. For those who love the drama of perfect crimes, the Riverton vanishing offered a blueprint. Exploit routine, loop digital tracks, use local knowledge, and move like smoke. For those who live with a human cost, it offered a painful lesson about how quickly a life can be reduced to questions. So, what do you think happened? Were Daniel and Tyrell architects of their own escape, pulling off a kind of inside job that movies romanticize? Were they coerced, traded, or eliminated by a team with capacity for quiet violence? Or was this an operation run by professionals so practiced at erasing their traces that even the clearest clues, burnt trucks, marked bills, anonymous postcards, could be folded into nothing? Leave your theories below. Your piece of the puzzle might be the one that helps someone see the pattern. If this story gripped you, like the video, subscribe for more cases that sit just on the edge of comprehension, and come back when we dig into another vanished thing, the ones that leave questions longer than answers.